Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are stripping away the red skin and the pitchfork to uncover the true, wild evolution of ultimate evil.
Oh, absolutely. It is a completely wild ride.
It really is because, if you asked an ancient Israelite who the devil was, they wouldn't point to some fiery underworld. They'd actually point to God's own heavenly courtroom.
Right, which is just wild to think about.
Exactly. So today we will travel from the heavenly throne rooms of ancient Israel, where the devil was just a divine prosecutor doing his job, through the Babylonian exile and Persian empires, all the way to the cosmic rebellion we recognize today.
Yeah, it's a massive historical trajectory.
And to do this, we're taking a stack of historical and theological analyses of ancient texts. Our mission for this deep dive is to use the lens of history to untangle the complex, centuries-long evolution of the concept of Satan and demons. Oh, and really quickly, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It helps us keep doing this.
It definitely does. And to set the baseline for you as we dig into these source materials, we really have to acknowledge that even today, belief in Satan varies wildly.
Oh, for sure. It's all over the map.
Right. Our sources highlight this really fascinating contrast. So, on one hand, you have Pope Francis actively warning against treating the devil as just a symbol or a myth. He argues that treating him as a metaphor, it lowers our spiritual guard.
Okay, so a very literal interpretation there.
Exactly. But then, on the flip side, a 2009 survey found that up to 40% of American Christians strongly agree that Satan is merely a symbol for evil, not a living entity at all.
Wow, that is a staggering divide for you to consider. Nearly half the people sitting in the pews might be viewing the ultimate bad guy as just a literary device.
Yeah, while the leader of the Catholic Church insists this is a real active threat.
But to be crystal clear for everyone listening, our goal today isn't to take a theological side or, debate the existence of the supernatural. We are just here to impartially explore how this entity evolved on the parchment over thousands of years.
Yeah, looking at this strictly through the historian's lens is, I think, what makes the material so compelling. We're asking this fundamental question about human thought. Like, how did our conceptualization of a cosmic enemy literally shift over time?
And if we're going to track that shift, we have to start by completely obliterating a caricature. Because, when you hear the word Satan, your brain probably instantly generates a very specific image.
Right? Definitely. The pop culture version.
Exactly. You might be picturing George Clooney's character in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Describing the devil as red and scaly with a bifurcated tail carrying a hay fork.
And the classic cartoon villain.
Right. You even see it pop up in science fiction. Like when a literal devil figure makes an appearance in Star Trek, The Next Generation.
Yeah, but what's so fascinating here is that this specific image, the horns, the cloven hooves, the red skin, it is entirely absent from the biblical text.
Entirely?
Entirely. You will not find that description anywhere in the ancient Hebrew or Greek manuscripts. That stereotypical portrayal is a much later artistic mashup.
So where did it come from?
Well, during the medieval and Renaissance periods, artists basically created a visual collage of different mythological elements. They glued together imagery from Greek gods like Pan with various pagan underworld figures. And this was centuries after the original texts were actually written.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we delete the Renaissance fan fiction and the pitchforks, the historical paper trail forces us back to the opening chapters of Genesis.
Right, back to the garden.
Yeah, and frankly, the setup there is completely different than the popular narrative. You have this perfectly ordered creation, which is called good 7 times, and suddenly there's a saboteur in the garden. And usually we just read this as a talking snake slithering out of an apple tree. But looking at our sources, it's better if you imagine a disgruntled, high-level corporate executive staging a hostile takeover.
That is a great analogy.
Thanks. It's not just a random mutiny. It's an insider convincing the junior staff that the CEO is holding them back from their true potential. It's fundamentally corrupting their wisdom.
And the Hebrew text thoroughly supports that framing of an insider corrupting the system. It's really interesting.
Oh, how so?
Well, when you examine later biblical authors reflecting on this garden narrative, they provide these glaring clues that this snake was always understood to be much more than an animal.
Okay.
Take the prophet Isaiah, for example. He describes a vision of God's heavenly throne room. And the spiritual creatures surrounding the throne are called seraphim.
Right, the seraphim.
Yeah, but in Hebrew, seraphim translates to burning ones or literally snake.
Oh, wow. That changes the entire architecture of the Eden story for you. We aren't dealing with a garden pest here. We are dealing with a former staff member of the divine throne room.
Exactly. And the prophet Ezekiel elaborates on this beautifully, too. He views this garden figure not as a reptile crawling in the dirt, but as this dazzling spiritual rebel who just refused to live under the Creator's authority.
He wanted to be the boss.
Right. This being wanted to rule by his own wisdom, which totally explains the specific temptation offered to Adam and Eve. It was basically, you don't need the Creator's definitions of good and evil. You can rule the world your own way.
So the original fracture in creation is an in-try job. It's a cosmic staff revolt that spills over into the human realm. But as I was reading the sources, one specific detail completely derailed my understanding. Let's talk about his name.
Ah, yes. The name issue.
Yeah, so we call him Satan. But the texts say that wasn't originally a name at all, right?
That's right. In the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible, the notion of a singular, supreme evil entity named Satan opposing God simply does not exist.
That is just, it's so counterintuitive to how we talk about it today.
It really is. The word Satan is not a proper name. In Hebrew, when it refers to this divine figure, it actually carries a direct object marker. It's ha-Satan.
Ha-Satan.
Exactly. And translated into English, that means the adversary or the accuser.
So what does this all mean? Wait, I need to push back on this because my brain is breaking a little bit here.
Go for it.
If he is this rogue executive causing humanity's downfall in Eden, how is he also showing up in books like Job and Zechariah as the Satan, where he seems to be clocking in for a 9-to-5 job as God's prosecuting attorney?
It does seem like a contradiction.
Right. Aren't those two textual sources completely contradicting each other?
Well, they appear contradictory until you remember that the Hebrew Bible is a library written over many, many centuries. It wasn't written all at once.
Okay, fair point.
So in the earlier historical periods reflected in Job, the Satan is effectively a divine job title. He operates within God's divine counsel. His assigned role is to test human loyalty, to sort of stress test the system, you know.
So he's on the payroll, basically.
Basically, yeah. In Job, God presides over a heavenly court, and the Satan acts as a legal adversary trying to prove that Job's faith is merely transactional. He's not the ruler of demons there. He's an employee of the court.
Wow. A prosecuting attorney just doing his assigned job is a massive leap from the Lord of Darkness, which means there has to be a massive gap in the timeline here.
Oh, there is. A very big one.
Yeah, because a cosmic prosecutor doesn't just wake up one day and decide to become the supreme ruler of a fiery underworld. You need a catalyst to force that kind of theological evolution.
And this is where historians rely on a framework called the 5 C's to map out these massive shifts.
Right, the 5 C's. Change over time, context, causality, complexity, and contingency.
Exactly. Because we can't run scientific experiments on historical theology, right? So we use this framework to uncover the mechanisms behind the text. We have to ask, why did the authors change how they wrote about evil?
And looking at the timeline in our sources, the theology of this divine prosecutor stays relatively flat for a long time, right up until 586 BCE.
That is the turning point.
So why does a geopolitical disaster in that specific year suddenly trigger the invention of a cosmic villain?
Well, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE was the ultimate historical contingency. The Babylonians sacked the city, they burned the temple to the ground, and they dragged the Judean elites into exile.
Which is just devastating.
Completely. You have to understand the profound psychological and theological trauma of this event. The Israelites believed their God was the supreme creator of the universe.
Right.
So if their God was all-powerful and perfectly good, how did a foreign empire just waltz in and burn his house down?
That's a massive crisis of faith.
It created unbearable cognitive dissonance. They desperately needed to rethink their theology to explain this profound suffering.
But trauma alone doesn't just, invent a dualistic universe. You need exposure to a completely different worldview for that. And our sources point out that another massive contingent event happens next.
Yes.
The Persians, right? The Achaemenid Persian Empire conquers Babylon and actually allows the Judeans to return home. But suddenly, the Israelites are living under Persian rule, interacting with a completely different religious framework.
And they lived under that Persian influence for 2 centuries, meaning they were heavily exposed to Zoroastrianism.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, this ancient Iranian religion is fundamentally dualistic. And it offered a very clean, simple answer to the problem of suffering.
Which they desperately needed.
Exactly. Zoroastrianism teaches that a perfectly good divine being named Ahura Mazda is locked in a relentless cosmic war with a wholly evil being named Angra Mainyu. It's a universe split right down the middle. Light versus dark, absolute good versus absolute evil.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can really see the mechanism of cultural exchange happening here.
Yeah.
The exiled Israelites are sitting in the ashes of their former lives, struggling to understand why the world is so hostile.
Mm-hmm.
And then they encounter this Persian idea of a cosmic war, and it acts as the theological relief valve. They start absorbing this dualistic framework to explain their own suffering so they don't have to blame their creator.
That's spot on. The complexity of this integration takes centuries, of course, but the textual fingerprints are undeniable.
Do we have a specific example from the texts?
We do. A brilliant example is found in the Jewish book of Tobit. The text introduces a demon named Asmodeus.
Okay. Asmodeus.
Yeah. And etymologically, the name Asmodeus is a direct adaptation of the Zoroastrian demon Eshma, who served as a lieutenant to the supreme evil being Angra Mainyu.
Wow. So they literally copy-pasted a villain from the neighboring empire's pantheon to explain their own trauma.
Pretty much, yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because they return from exile, their temple is rebuilt, but they are still living under the thumb of successive foreign empires. First the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans.
The oppression never really stopped.
Exactly. So they still need a way to explain why their world is so utterly corrupt. And this triggers what scholars call the Second Temple period, which is just an absolute explosion of apocalyptic literature.
It's a very busy literary period.
Like it's a comic book universe,
Yeah.
suddenly fracturing into a multiverse. You have a whole cast of villains competing to be the ultimate bad guy.
Yeah, the literature from this era reveals a culture just desperate to make sense of systemic injustice. We see this vividly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which introduce a concept called the Two Spirits theology.
Two spirits theology, okay.
Yeah, to justify why their society felt so deeply corrupt, these writers proposed that the God of Israel had actually created spirits of both light and darkness.
Oh, interesting.
So suddenly, the ancient texts describe the archangel Michael leading the sons of light in a literal cosmic war against a malevolent angel named Belial, who commands the sons of darkness.
Okay, so Belial steps into the ring as a top contender for ultimate evil. But the sources show he wasn't the only one, right? There's this incredibly weird, brief story in Genesis chapter 6 about the sons of God interacting with human women.
Oh, yes, the Nephilim narrative.
Right. And during this Second Temple period, an ancient text called First Enoch expands that tiny fragment into a massive apocalyptic epic.
It really does. First, Enoch details the story of the Watchers. These were divine beings who rebelled against the heavenly order, descended to earth, and seduced human women.
And the result of that?
The birth of the Nephilim, these violent warrior giants who basically filled the earth with bloodshed.
And crucially, these Watchers didn't just mess with the human gene pool. They handed humanity the loaded gun of civilization.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, the text says they taught humans magic, astrology, how to forge swords, how to make cosmetics. They essentially taught humans the art of self-destruction.
Yeah, they brought the corruption down to earth.
But here is the massive twist for you listening. If you asked a modern person who led this angelic rebellion, they'd confidently say Satan. But first, Enoch completely ignores the name Satan.
Entirely. The chief villains orchestrating this rebellion in First Enoch are named Shemihasa and Asael.
Not Satan at all.
Nope. And in one of the highly symbolic dream visions within the text, these rebel angels are actually depicted as stars falling from the sky.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This specific literary moment is where humanity first gets the vivid, enduring imagery of evil angels physically plummeting from heaven.
Just to make the multiverse even more chaotic, another text from the exact same era, the Book of Jubilees, calls the leader of the demons Mastema.
Right, Mastem.
So for you trying to map this out, we have Belial, Shemihasa, Asael, and Mastema. This entire era was a frantic melting pot of apocalyptic trauma, Persian dualism, and ancient rebel angel lore, all just churning together.
And that churning melting pot is the exact theological soil from which the early Jesus movement grew.
Okay, so how does it consolidate?
Well, by the time we reach the New Testament texts, the title Satan, along with the Greek word diabolos, which means the slanderer, had effectively absorbed all the sinister traits of Belial, Mastema, and the Persian Angra Mainyu.
It's like Satan became the corporate umbrella for all these different rebel entities. He just became the singular mascot for the cosmic rebellion.
Exactly. For Jesus and his first-century followers, this accumulated force of spiritual evil and death was the true enemy. When Jesus faced opposition, he didn't really view the Roman Empire or corrupt religious leaders as his ultimate foes.
Right, it was deeper than that.
Much deeper. He viewed the spiritual rebellion animating those human structures as the core threat to God's creation.
I'm really glad you brought up the word animating, because I think we need to fundamentally redefine how we understand the word demons based on these sources.
It's definitely misunderstood today.
For sure.
Yeah.
When we hear demons today, our minds go straight to horror movies. Spinning heads, levitation, pea soup, all of that.
Yeah.
But the ancient biblical context defines demons much more systemically, right? They were understood as spiritual forces that drove corrupt human power structures.
Yeah, it is a profound socio-political critique wrapped up in theological language. You can actually trace this back to Deuteronomy, where Moses argues that God handed the surrounding oppressive nations over to worship the rebel host of heaven.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and Moses is the first to label these beings demons, but he isn't warning about monsters under the bed. He's warning against the spiritual forces behind the gods of money, the gods of sex, and the gods of military power.
Which links perfectly to the Genesis 10 story of Nimrod, because our sources point out that Nimrod's name literally echoes the Hebrew word for rebel. And what is Nimrod's defining act? He builds Babylon, which is the ultimate symbol of a violent empire-building city. So the demonic, in this ancient framework, is basically the spiritual engine driving human empires to conquer, enslave, and hoard wealth.
Exactly. The biblical authors are making a highly sophisticated argument here. Spiritual evil operates behind the curtain of corrupt human institutions. It exploits our baseline greed and selfishness to drag God's ordered, flourishing creation back into chaos and death.
Okay, but if you grew up in a Western context, looking at this historical timeline is going to feel like a massive rug pull. Because there is one glaring name we haven't mentioned once yet.
I was wondering when we'd get to him.
What about Lucifer? How did a divine prosecutor eventually get the name Lucifer?
The Lucifer accident. Yes.
This raises an important question about how historical amnesia and translation errors can literally invent mythology out of thin air. For centuries, people have pointed to the book of Isaiah, where the prophet says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn."
Right, that's the famous line. And this has been widely interpreted as the definitive origin story of Satan being cast out of heaven.
But Isaiah wasn't talking about a cosmic spiritual battle at all, was he?
Not even remotely. In its original context, the prophet Isaiah is delivering this blistering, sarcastic oracle against a deeply arrogant human ruler, the king of Babylon.
Wait, really? A human king?
Yes. Isaiah mocks this earthly king by comparing him to the morning star, the planet Venus. Venus appears brightly in the early dawn sky, but is immediately humiliated and erased the moment the actual sun rises.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It's a brilliant astronomical metaphor for a tyrant whose ego got way too big and who is about to be brought down to earth.
So it's basically a political diss track. Isaiah drops a diss track on a human king. How in the world does a metaphor about a Babylonian tyrant become the proper name of the devil?
The transformation happens centuries later during the translation of the Hebrew manuscripts into Latin. The Latin term for morning star or light bringer happens to be, you guessed it, Lucifer.
Oh, no way.
Yes. So the Latin Vulgate translated Isaiah's phrase as Lucifer. And over subsequent generations, readers entirely forgot the historical context of the human Babylonian king.
They just saw the word.
Exactly. They read the capitalized word Lucifer, conceptually linked it to the falling star imagery from 1st Enoch that we talked about earlier, and falsely concluded they were reading the origin story and proper name of the devil.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. I mean, we took a sarcastic political poem about a human dictator, translated it into a different language, stripped away all of its original historical context, and accidentally gave ultimate evil its most famous brand name.
It is the ultimate demonstration of change over time. Texts are authored in one specific cultural moment, but as they are carried forward, they are read and interpreted by new cultures facing entirely different crises.
And that changes the meaning.
Completely. It causes the texts to take on profound new meanings that the original authors never even intended.
Wow. So to summarize this incredibly wild journey for you, we started with the Satan, a divine courtroom employee whose only job was testing human loyalty. Then, the horrific trauma of the Babylonian exile shattered that worldview. The subsequent exposure to Persian Zoroastrian dualism provided a new framework, sparking a chaotic, literary explosion of apocalyptic rebel angel lore watchers, falling stars, Belial, and Mastema.
Very busy era.
Very busy. And finally, all of those disparate threads solidified during the New Testament era into the singular, ultimate symbol of anti-creation, absorbing Latin translation accidents and Renaissance fan fiction along the way.
This raises an important question for how we engage with these ancient texts today. Because whether you view this centuries-long evolution as a purely human coping mechanism for trauma, or as humanity slowly waking up to a deeper spiritual reality, the core critique within these texts remains startlingly relevant.
How so?
Well, spiritual evil, as defined by these ancient writers, isn't about spooky possessions. It is about whatever forces actively drag a good, ordered world back into chaos and division.
Right.
It's about the personal greed and the corrupt, systemic human power structures that actively exploit the vulnerable.
And that leaves you with a really fascinating thought to mull over. We've just watched how the concept of supreme evil evolved so dramatically in the ancient world, driven by the trauma of political exiles, the blending of Persian and Israelite cultures, and literal translation errors.
Yeah.
If history is any guide, how might our modern world be subtly reshaping that concept right now? In our hyper-connected, globalized digital age, where algorithms are designed to drive societal division and artificial intelligence is rapidly shifting our understanding of consciousness and truth. How are we currently redefining evil?
That's a great question.
What will the Satan of 1,000 years from now look like? Because looking at the data, I can promise you one thing. It won't be a guy in a red suit holding a pitchfork.